He is a 14-year-old boy with no education. His father is a railway worker earning pennies. His mother was humiliated at the grocery store because the shopkeeper refused to give her credit. She could not buy food for her family that night. You would think a kid from a village of less than 100 people in rural Spain, a kid who would never finish school, could never build anything of significance, right? Well, that kid would grow up to create Zara, the largest fashion retailer on the planet. He would build a company generating over 38 billion euros in annual revenue, operating more than 7,400 stores across 93 countries. And for a brief, incredible moment in 2015, he would surpass Bill Gates to become the richest human being alive. So how did a poor Spanish boy with no formal education become worth over $100 billion? To find out, we have to go back to 1936 to a tiny village called Bustongo de Arbas. March 28, 1936. Amancio Ortega Gaona was born into a world that was about to tear itself apart. Spain was on the brink of civil war. His father, Antonio, worked for the railroad. His mother, Josefa, cleaned houses for wealthier families. They were the kind of poor where some nights dinner was just potatoes. Amancio was the youngest of 4 children, which meant hand-me-downs were a way of life and new things were a luxury the Ortega family simply could not afford. The family lived in poverty. The family would eventually move to La Coruna, a port city in the northwestern region of Galicia. His father had been transferred to the local railway station, and the family followed, hoping for a slightly better life. But things did not get much easier. In post-war Spain, poverty was not just common, it was everywhere. The Ortegas were right in the thick of it, but even as a young boy, Amancio had something that set him apart. He was quiet, intensely quiet, an introvert in a culture that celebrated loud voices and big personalities. While other kids were playing football in the streets, Amancio was watching how people moved through shops, what caught their attention in a window display, what made them reach for their wallets, what made them walk away. He had an almost instinctive sense for commerce, even if he did not know what to call it yet. His teachers noticed he was bright, but school felt irrelevant to a boy whose family could barely afford dinner. The lessons that mattered to Amancio were not in textbooks. They were in the streets of La Coruna. And then came the moment that would change everything. Amancio was around 12 or 13 years old when he walked with his mother to the local grocery store. She needed to buy food for the family on credit, something many families in the neighborhood did. But that day, the shopkeeper looked at her and said no. He refused, right there in front of her son. The humiliation on his mother's face would burn itself into Amancio's memory. He would later say that was the day everything changed for him. That was the day he decided he would never let his family go without again. The very next day, Amancio told his mother he was done with school. She was shocked. He was barely a teenager, but his mind was made up. He would find a job and start earning money, and that is exactly what he did. He walked into a shop called Gala, a men's clothing store just 200 meters from where he would one day open his first Zara store. He got a job as a delivery boy, running shirts and suits across town. He was fast, reliable, and he never complained. Within months, his boss noticed something. This kid was not just delivering clothes, he was studying them, feeling the fabric, watching which customers bought what, and asking questions about pricing and margins. By the time he was 15, he had been promoted. By his early 20s, he was practically running the place, but Amancio wanted more. Working at Gala and then at another boutique called La Maja, where his brother Antonio and sister Josefa also worked, had taught him something critical. He had watched how clothing was made, distributed, and sold. And he noticed a massive problem. The gap between what it cost to make a garment and what the customer paid was enormous. Middlemen, distributors, retailers, they all took their cut. And by the time a simple dress reached the customer, it cost 5 or 6 times what it should have been. Amancio thought, what if you could cut out all those middlemen, make the clothes yourself, and sell them directly to the customer? What if fashion did not have to be expensive? This idea would consume him for the next decade, but he was not ready yet. He needed to learn more, and he needed to build something first. In 1963, at the age of 27, Amancio Ortega would take the first real step toward building his empire. Along with his then girlfriend, Rosalia Mera, and his siblings, he founded a small company called Confecciones Goa. The name was simply his initials reversed, a small detail that tells you something about Amancio. Even the company name was understated. No grand vision statement, no flashy branding, just initials rearranged. They started making quilted bathrobes in a tiny first-floor apartment in La Coruna. Rosalia and his brother's wife, Primitiva Renedo, would stitch the garments by hand while Amancio handled everything else, sourcing fabric from Barcelona, finding buyers, managing the money, and keeping track of every single peseta. And here is where his genius first showed itself. Instead of selling through the traditional chain of wholesalers and retailers, Amancio organized local women into sewing cooperatives. He sourced textiles directly from producers in Barcelona, cutting out the intermediaries who inflated prices at every step. He eliminated every middleman he could find. The result was simple but revolutionary. Goa could sell bathrobes for 140 pesetas when everyone else was charging far more for the same quality. Customers noticed, word spread, orders kept coming in. However, this early success was fragile. Cash flow was a constant problem. There were no investors knocking on the door, no banks willing to lend money to a young man with no education, no formal business training, and no track record beyond making bathrobes in an apartment. Every peseta Amancio made went right back into the business. He and Rosalia married in 1966, and together they would pour everything they had into Goa, every peseta, every hour, every ounce of energy. There were nights when they did not know if the business would survive the month, but quitting was never an option. Amancio had made a promise to himself on the day his mother was humiliated, and he intended to keep it. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Goa had grown steadily. The product line expanded beyond bathrobes into other garments. Amancio began exploring markets outside of Galicia, traveling the roads of Spain to find new customers. By the early 1970s, GOA employed over 500 people. The company even had its own brand labels, appearing on garments sold across the country. But Amancio was still restless. He did not want to be a manufacturer selling to other people's stores. He wanted his own stores. He wanted to control the entire process, from the thread to the customer's hands. He had even tried opening a small retail store called Sprint on Torero Street in La Coruna, distributing other people's brands. It did not work. The experience taught him a crucial lesson. If he was going to sell clothes, they had to be his clothes, his designs, his prices, his vision. And in 1975, he would finally get his chance. May 9th, 1975. Amancio Ortega, then 39 years old, opened the doors to his first retail store on Juan Flores Street in central La Coruna. He had originally wanted to name it Zorba, after the classic film Zorba the Greek from 1964. He had even had the letters made, but there was a problem. A bar just 2 blocks away already had that name. So Amancio rearranged the letters and came up with a new name, Zara. It was an accident. One of the most recognizable brand names in the history of fashion was born from a last-minute scramble. But the name was the least important part. What mattered was what was inside. Zara sold fashionable clothing at prices that ordinary people could actually afford. This was not luxury fashion hidden behind velvet ropes and snobby salespeople. This was style for everyone. Amancio had spent 2 decades learning how clothing moved from factory to customer, and he had built a system that eliminated the waste, the markups, and the delays that plagued the traditional fashion industry. If a woman saw a dress on a mannequin in a department store window that cost a fortune, she could walk into Zara and find something remarkably similar for a fraction of the price, and she could buy it right now, not next season when the trend had already faded. Every weekend, Amancio was in the store himself, talking to the saleswomen, chatting with customers, watching what they picked up and what they put back. This was not micromanagement. This was research. Amancio was building a feedback loop that would become the foundation of everything Zara would become. He did not need focus groups or market research firms. He had his own eyes and ears, and he trusted them more than any consultant. The store was a hit. Lines formed on weekends. And this was not all. Within just a few years, Amancio would open several more Zara stores across Galician cities. By the end of the 1970s, there were already a dozen locations throughout the region. Customers could not get enough. The formula was working. Yet Amancio knew that selling cheap clothes alone would not be enough to build something truly massive. He needed speed. The traditional fashion industry operated on a seasonal calendar. Designers would show collections months in advance. Manufacturers would produce them over weeks or months. And by the time the clothes hit the stores, the trends had often already shifted. It was slow, wasteful, and completely disconnected from what customers actually wanted. Amancio would turn this entire model on its head. He began developing a system where Zara could design, produce, and deliver new garments to stores in as little as 2 weeks. 2 weeks, while competitors like Gap and H&M took 4 to 8 weeks minimum. Zara was refreshing its inventory twice a week. Think about that for a moment. Twice a week. That meant every time a customer walked into a Zara store, there was something new to discover. And if she did not buy that dress today, it might not be there tomorrow. This created an incredible sense of urgency that the fashion industry had never seen before. Customers did not just browse at Zara. They bought because they knew the window of opportunity was tiny. The mantra became, buy now or miss out forever. And it worked. But this was not just clever marketing. Building this system required an engineering mindset that would have made Henry Ford proud. In fact, many business analysts have compared Amancio to Ford, and I think the comparison is spot on. Both men obsessed over eliminating waste, increasing efficiency through technology, and lowering prices to boost volume. Ford did it with cars, Amancio did it with fashion. And just like Ford, Amancio understood that speed was not just an advantage, it was the advantage. In the early 1980s, Amancio set up his own factory in La Coruña and began investing heavily in technology. In 1976, he purchased his first computer, making him one of the very first fashion executives in Spain to do so. He then hired a local university professor named José María Castellano to develop the company's computing systems. Most fashion companies at that time were not thinking about computers. They were thinking about fabric patterns and runway shows. Amancio was already building digital infrastructure to track inventory, manage supply chains, and respond to real-time customer demand. Castellano would become one of the most important figures in the company's history. eventually leading the company as chief executive officer and orchestrating the initial public offering decades later. And Amancio did not stop there. He implemented something radical for the fashion world. He brought in consultants from the automotive industry to redesign his manufacturing process. Think about how unusual that was, a clothing company studying car factories. But it made perfect sense to Amancio. He wanted his factories to operate with the same precision, the same efficiency, the same responsiveness as a Toyota assembly line. And that is exactly what he built. And here is where things would take a dramatic turn. In 1985, Amancio made a decision that would define the next era of his life. He created a holding company called Inditex, which stood for Industria de Diseño Textil. This would be the umbrella under which Zara and all future brands would operate. That same year, 5 critical things happened almost simultaneously. Castellano officially joined the leadership team. Goe's factories were dedicated exclusively to Zara production. The wholesale business was abandoned entirely. A consulting team from the automotive sector was brought in, and Inditex was formally incorporated. It was as if Amancio had been building a rocket for a decade and was now finally ready to light the engines. However, there was trouble at home. Amancio and Rosalia's marriage was falling apart. In 1986, they divorced. Rosalia had been there from the very beginning, stitching bathrobes by hand in that tiny apartment. She was the co-founder of everything Amancio had built. The divorce was devastating, not just personally, but professionally. Rosalia retained a significant stake in Inditex, becoming its second largest shareholder. She would go on to become the richest, self-made woman in the world before her tragic death from a brain hemorrhage in 2013. Their story is a reminder that behind every empire, there are human costs that balance sheets never capture. But Amancio would not slow down. In December of 1988, he made the boldest move of his career. Zara opened its first store outside of Spain, in Porto, Portugal. It was a test. Could the Zara model work beyond Spanish borders? Could a regional brand compete internationally? The answer came fast. Porto was a hit. Emboldened, Amancio would push further. In 1989, Zara landed in New York City with a store on Lexington Avenue. And in 1990, it arrived in Paris. Let me say that again. New York and Paris, the 2 fashion capitals of the world. The cities where Chanel, Dior, Gucci, and every other legendary fashion house had established their dominance over decades. And here was Amancio Ortega, a man with no design degree, no fashion school training, no connections to the industry elite, opening stores right in their backyard. There is a story about the opening of Zara's Manhattan store that captures the essence of who Amancio Ortega really is. When he arrived for the opening and saw the crowds of customers pouring through the doors, he was so overwhelmed with emotion that he locked himself in the bathroom. He was not being dramatic. He was processing. This was the kid who could not afford dinner, the teenager who delivered shirts for pennies, and now customers in New York City, the most competitive retail market on earth, were lining up to buy his clothes. For a self-taught kid from rural Spain who never finished school, this was nothing short of extraordinary. In 1989, the New York Times published an article about the Zara store on Lexington Avenue, and in doing so, it used a phrase that had never appeared in print before. As fashion, Amancio Ortega had not just built a company, he had invented an entirely new category of retail, and the world was starting to take notice. But international expansion brought new challenges. Managing supply chains across borders was enormously complicated. Logistics that worked perfectly within Spain began to break down across oceans and time zones. In the early 1990s, Inditex even flirted with debt to finance its growth, something Amancio had always avoided. The company's debt rose to over 16% of assets by 1995. For a man who had built everything on financial discipline, this was uncomfortable territory. Yet Amancio would find a solution. Beginning in 1990, he partnered with Toyota to implement a just-in-time manufacturing system in Inditex's factories. This was a concept borrowed from the automobile industry, and nobody in fashion had ever tried it. The idea was simple but powerful. Instead of producing massive quantities of clothing and hoping it would sell, you would produce small batches, measure demand in real time, and then produce more of what was actually selling. It was the opposite of how fashion had always worked, and it was revolutionary. By the mid-1990s, Zara had stores in Mexico, Greece, Belgium, Sweden, Malta, Cyprus, Norway, Turkey, Japan, Israel, Argentina, and the United Kingdom. The expansion was relentless, but it was not reckless. Unlike many brands that waited to perfect their domestic operations before going international, Amancio was audacious. He had tested the waters in Barcelona in 1983, opening a store on Pelayo Street. If Zara could work in Catalonia, a region with its own distinct fashion culture, it could work anywhere in Spain. And if it could work in Spain, it could work in the world. By the end of the 1980s, Zara already had stores in every Spanish city with more than 100,000 people. The domestic dominance was complete. Now it was time to conquer the globe. And throughout this entire period, Amancio was building new brands. In 1991, he launched Pull & Bear. He acquired 65% of Massimo Dutti in 1995 and would eventually buy it outright. Bershka came in 1998. Stradivarius was acquired in 1999. Each brand targeted a different customer segment, but they all ran on the same lightning-fast supply chain that Amancio had pioneered with Zara. Almost nothing was spent on advertising. While competitors poured hundreds of millions into magazine spreads, television commercials, and celebrity endorsements, Zara relied almost entirely on word of mouth and prime store locations. Most fashion companies spent 3 to 4% of their revenue on marketing. Zara spent less than 0.5%. Amancio understood something profound that most business people miss. If you put the right product at the right price in the right location, customers will come, and they will tell their friends. You do not need to convince people to want great fashion at affordable prices. You just need to make it available. The store itself was the advertisement. The window display was the marketing campaign. Every Zara location was carefully chosen to be on the most prestigious shopping streets in the world. Fifth Avenue in New York, Champs-Élysées in Paris, Oxford Street in London, Ginza in Tokyo, Nanjing Road in Shanghai. Amancio wanted Zara to stand shoulder to shoulder with the luxury brands, not to compete on price with discount retailers, but to say to the customer, "We belong here and you can afford us." The store was the brand, the experience was the marketing, and it worked better than any advertisement ever could. Amancio also saw the power of scarcity. Because Zara produced clothing in small batches and refreshed inventory constantly, items sold out quickly. Customers learned that if they saw something they liked, they had to buy it immediately. There was no going home to think about it. There was no coming back next week. The dress would be gone. This sense of urgency drove sales volumes that made traditional retailers dizzy. Zara was producing over 12,000 different styles per year, while most competitors produced a fraction of that. By the year 2000, Inditex had grown from a single store to over 1,000 locations, generating $2.4 billion in annual sales. Amancio had built something that had never existed before in the fashion world, but the biggest moment was still coming. May 23, 2001. Inditex went public on the Bolsa de Madrid. The initial public offering sold 26% of the company to investors, and it was massive. Over 2.4 billion euros changed hands, making it one of the largest public offerings in Spanish history. The company was valued at 9 billion euros. Overnight, Amancio Ortega went from being a wealthy businessman to one of the richest men in Spain. He still owned nearly 60% of the company. Amancio did not go public to raise money for expansion. Unlike most companies that go public to fund growth, Inditex was already profitable enough to expand on its own. The company had been reducing its debt for years, financing itself mostly by reinvesting profits. He went public because he believed it was the right thing to do. He wanted transparency. He wanted scrutiny. He wanted the world to see how his company operated, because he was confident that what he had built could withstand any examination. And here is what tells you everything about the man. On the day of the initial public offering, when his net worth increased by billions of euros in a single afternoon, Amancio reportedly worked a normal schedule. He ate lunch in the company cafeteria with his employees. No special meal, no champagne. He did not throw a party. He did not give a press conference. He did not even have his own office. He never had. Amancio spent every day on his feet, walking the factory floor, talking to designers, examining fabrics. He just went back to work. Because for Amancio Ortega, the work was never about the money. It was about the mission. He once said, "I am the property of my business, not the reverse." And on IPO day, he proved it. The years following the IPO would see explosive growth. Inditex doubled its store count between 1999 and 2004. By 2004, the company's 2000th store opened in Hong Kong. Amancio launched new brands, Oysho for lingerie in 2001 and Zara Home for household goods in 2003. He was building not just a company, but an ecosystem of brands, each one targeting a different customer, but all powered by the same revolutionary supply chain. And that mission would face its greatest test during the 2008 financial crisis. The global economy collapsed. Retailers around the world were shutting their doors. The fashion industry was in freefall. Spanish stocks tumbled. Companies that had seemed invincible were suddenly fighting for survival. But Inditex didn't just survive the crisis, it thrived. While competitors contracted, shutting stores and laying off thousands, Zara kept opening new locations, while others slashed prices in desperate clearance sales, flooding the market with unwanted inventory. Zara's model of producing small batches meant it rarely had excess inventory to begin with. The just-in-time system that Amancio had spent decades perfecting wasn't just efficient, it was crisis-proof. It was anti-fragile. The worse things got for the economy, the more Zara's model looked like genius. You see, when consumers tighten their belts during a recession, they don't stop buying clothes. They just become more selective. They want fashionable clothes at lower prices. And who was perfectly positioned to deliver exactly that? Zara, the company that had been built from day one around the idea of affordable fashion. While luxury brands saw their customers disappear and discount retailers struggled with thin margins, Zara occupied the perfect middle ground, trendy enough to feel exciting, affordable enough to feel responsible, fast enough to feel fresh. From 2009 to 2014, while the world was still reeling from the financial crisis, Amancio Ortega's personal net worth increased by $45 billion. That is not a typo, $45 billion. Inditex's stock rose while other Spanish companies crumbled. The company that a boy from Busdongo de Arbas had built with bathrobes and borrowed fabric was now the most valuable fashion enterprise on the planet. In 2011, Amancio would make another significant decision. He stepped down as chairman of Inditex, handing the reins to Pablo Isla, a trusted executive. But stepping down didn't mean stepping away. Amancio still visited the headquarters in Artecho almost every day. He still walked the floors. He still talked to the designers. He still ate lunch in the cafeteria. He was still, at his core, the delivery boy from Gala who couldn't stop watching how the business worked. And then came the crowning moment. In October of 2015, Inditex's stock surged, and for a brief window, Amancio Ortega's net worth peaked at $80 billion. He had surpassed Bill Gates. The poor boy from Bustongo de Arbas, the kid who dropped out of school at 14, the delivery boy who earned pennies running shirts across La Coruna, was now the richest person on the face of the earth. Bill Gates had gone to Harvard. Warren Buffett had studied under Benjamin Graham at Columbia. The titans of industry that Amancio had surpassed had every advantage imaginable: education, connections, capital, technology. Amancio had none of it. All he had was a work ethic forged in poverty and a vision that fashion belonged to everyone. The reaction from the business world was one of stunned disbelief. How had a man that most people had never heard of, a man whose photograph did not even exist publicly until 1999, quietly built a fortune that eclipsed the most famous billionaires on the planet? The answer was hiding in plain sight. While everyone else was chasing headlines, Amancio was chasing efficiency. While everyone else was building personal brands, Amancio was building systems. While everyone else was giving TED Talks and writing books and posting on social media, Amancio was in the cafeteria, eating lunch with his employees. And this is remarkable when you consider where he started. No education, no connections, no inherited wealth, no investors, no business school training. Just a burning memory of his mother's humiliation at a grocery store and an unshakable belief that fashion should be for everyone, not just the wealthy. He once said, "We are all born for something," with the absolute conviction that he had a mission to fulfill. That mission started the day he was 12 years old, standing in a grocery store, watching his mother's face fall. When asked about his approach to business, Amancio shared, "The customer has always driven the business model." In another rare moment, he offered, "I am the property of my business, not the reverse." And perhaps most telling of all, he famously stated, "You must appear 3 times in the newspapers: when you are born, when you get married, and when you die." That last quote captures everything about who Amancio Ortega is. A man who built one of the greatest business empires in history while remaining almost completely invisible. Before 1999, there was not a single publicly available photograph of him. He has given only 3 interviews in his entire life. He does not wear his own brand's clothes. He eats in the company cafeteria. He visits the same coffee shop every day in La Coruna. He raises chickens on his country estate. Today, Inditex operates over 7,400 stores in 93 countries. Zara alone has more than 2,000 locations, making it the largest fashion retailer on the planet. The company generates nearly 39 billion euros in annual revenue and employs over 160,000 people worldwide. Amancio Ortega's personal fortune now exceeds $100 billion, making him one of the 10 wealthiest human beings alive. And he has used that wealth in ways that reflect who he has always been. Through his foundation, he has donated over 320 million euros to fight cancer in Spain, funding 440 machines to detect the disease and increasing the number of Spanish public hospitals with advanced radiotherapy equipment from 20 to 70. He funds scholarships, sending 500 Spanish students to study abroad every year. He donated 20 million euros to Caritas, the largest single donation the organization had ever received. His daughter, Marta Ortega Perez, now serves as chairwoman of Inditex, and her story mirrors her father's in the most important way. She did not walk into the boardroom with a title. She started on the shop floor as a sales assistant, learning the business from the ground up, just as Amancio did when he was a delivery boy at Gala more than 60 years ago. In May of 2025, Zara celebrated its 50th anniversary by renovating that original store on Juan Flores Street, the same street where a teenage Amancio once delivered shirts for a few pesetas. But Amancio Ortega's legacy isn't just about the money, or the stores, or the stock price. It's about what he proved. He proved that you don't need a degree to understand business. You don't need wealthy parents to build wealth. You don't need to be the loudest voice in the room to change an entire industry. He invented fast fashion before anyone even had a name for it. He democratized style. He showed the world that a quiet, observant boy from a village of less than 100 people could outthink, outwork, and outbuild the most powerful fashion houses on earth. And he did it all by remembering a simple truth that his mother taught him without ever saying a word. Fashion isn't about exclusivity. It's about giving people what they want, when they want it, at a price they can afford. That is how a poor Spanish boy created Zara. And that is why the name Amancio Ortega will be remembered long after the last receipt is printed.